close off the Gaza side of the border. That includes almost half the arable land, according to the leading academic scholar of Gaza, Harvard's Sarah Roy. While a showcase for the human capacity for violence and humiliation, Gaza is also an inspiring exemplar of the demand for dignity. The first phrase one hears in Gaza when asking about personal aspirations is for a life of dignity. The distinguished human rights lawyer, internationally known human rights lawyer, Raji Sourani, writes from his Gaza home that what has to be kept in mind is that the occupation and the absolute closure is an ongoing attack on the human dignity of the people in Gaza in particular, and all Palestinians generally. It is systematic degradation, humiliation, isolation, fragmentation of the Palestinian people. While bombs were once again raining down on defenseless civilians in Gaza last November, he repeated that we demand justice and accountability. We dream of a normal life in freedom and dignity. And others perceive the same reality. In The Lancet, leading international medical journal, a visiting Stanford physician who was appalled by what he witnessed described Gaza as something of a laboratory for observing an absence of dignity, a condition that has devastating effects on physical, mental, and social well-being. Still quoting him, the constant surveillance from the sky, collective punishment through blockade and isolation, the intrusion into homes and communications, restrictions on those trying to travel or marry or work, make it difficult to live a dignified life in Gaza. A young woman professional who managed to escape from Gaza to Canada, doctor there, Ghada Agil is her name. She writes about her a couple of weeks ago, about her 87-year-old grandmother who's still trapped in the Gaza prison. Before her expulsion, she writes, she owned a house, farms, and land, and she enjoyed honor, dignity, and hope. And amazingly, like Palestinians rather generally, she hasn't given up hope. So Agil continues, when I saw my grandmother in November 2012, she was unusually happy, right in the midst of the latest atrocities. Surprised by her high spirits, I asked for an explanation. She looked me in the eye and, to my surprise, said that she was no longer worried about her native village and the life of dignity that she has lost, for her irrevocably. When I see you, her grandmother said, I know that our native village, long ago destroyed, is in your heart, and I also know that you're not alone in your journey. Don't be discouraged, we're getting there. The call for dignity resounds through the Arab Spring, which, despite all of its uncertain outcomes, is doubtless a development of historic significance. Prominent Lebanese commentator Rami Khouri writes that the process at hand now in Tunisia and Egypt will continue to ripple through the entire Arab world as ordinary citizens realize that they must seize and protect their birthrights of freedom and dignity. The uprising, as you know, was sparked by the self-immolation of Muhammad Bouazizi in reaction to his humiliating and degrading treatment. Muhammad did what he did for the sake of his dignity, his mother recounts. On the anniversary of his suicide, a cart statue, sold things from a cart. The cart statue was unveiled in his honor in the town where he carried out the action that triggered the uprising and spread throughout Middle East, North Africa. The ceremony was attended by Tunisia's first elected president, who thanked him and those he inspired for bringing dignity to the entire Tunisian people. Now, in the oil dictatorships, the uprisings have been suppressed, often by violence, much to the relief of Western powers, but not entirely. So in Kuwait, while protesters were fleeing from the riot police, a Kuwaiti political scientist commented that people want dignity and political participation and equality before the law, and not a revolution. Not the Kuwaiti citizens, at least. The great majority who do the work might have other ideas in mind. Such driving sentiments of oppressed people extend far beyond the Arab Spring. We've just passed the centenary of the great textile strike of immigrant workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts, near where I live, led by the Wobblies, who played a leading role in the labor movement until it was crushed a few years later by Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. The strikers won the strike under the banner "Bread and Roses," now a famous slogan, sustenance and dignity. And today, immigrant workers and immigrant activists in the United States organize in what they call the Immigrant Dignity Campaign. The lively labor press of the early Industrial Revolution bitterly condemned the rising industrial system for depriving those driven to the mills of their dignity as free human beings. The early 1970s witnessed the last militant strike wave in the United States before the labor movement has once again been crushed under the neoliberal assault on the population, which is taking place everywhere. You're suffering from it here. The strikes were a call for bread and roses, for workers' control of the workplace, so that they could uphold their basic dignity. And that continues today with the spread of worker-owned enterprises and cooperatives on a rather impressive scale. These aspirations have been suppressed by violence throughout history, but the spark's never extinguished, and it continues to burst into flames. The search for dignity is understood instinctively by those who hold the clubs and who recognize that apart from violence, the best way to undermine it is by humiliation. That's second nature in prisons everywhere. It reaches its sordid extreme in places like Bagram and Guantanamo, portrayed unforgettably by Victoria Britton, who's recently broadened the shameful picture to include the fate of the women left behind. The normal practice in Israeli prisons has gained some attention in the last couple of weeks because of the concern that it might spark another uprising, third intifada, after the death of a young man, Arafat Jaradat. He was arrested at his home at midnight, of course. That's to properly intimidate the family. He was charged with having thrown stones and a Molotov cocktail a few months earlier during Israel's November attack on Gaza. He was healthy and vigorous when arrested. He was last seen alive in court by his lawyer, who describes him as doubled over, scared, confused, and shrunken. The court reacted by remanding him to another 12 days of what's called interrogation, and he was found dead in his cell. Israeli journalist Amira Haas writes that Palestinians do not need an Israeli investigation. For them, Jaradat's death is much bigger than the tragedy he and his family have suffered. From their experience, Jaradat's death is proof that the Israeli system routinely uses torture, and from their experience, they know that the goal of torture is not only to convict someone, but to deter and subjugate an entire people by humiliation, degradation, terror, familiar features of repression at home and abroad. And Europeans should not overlook their willing and significant participation in the latest phase of Washington's reign of torture. I say latest phase because there are ample precedents. The Open Society Institute just released its study called Globalizing Torture, CIA Secret Detentions and Extraordinary Rendition. You know what that means, sending people to the most miserable dictatorships that can be tortured properly without us saying we're doing it. The study reveals that 54 countries participated in the campaign. That included most of Europe and most of the rest of the world. Actually, one region of the world was exempt, Latin America. Virtually alone, it refused to participate in globalizing torture. And that's quite a remarkable fact. Only a few years ago, Latin America remained Washington's obedient backyard, did what it was told. And it was also, during this period, one of the torture capitals of the world, and not any longer. One can easily see why Western elites are so concerned about the threat of democracy and so committed to limiting it, most recently in the Middle East. The need for humiliating those who raise their heads is an ineradicable element of the imperial mentality. Just cite one typical case. There's a highly regarded liberal commentator of the New York Times, also a Mideast specialist, Thomas Friedman. He was asked on TV for his recommendations for the U.S.-UK occupying army in Iraq a couple of months after the invasion. And his answer was elegant and forthright. I'll quote him. He said, "We needed to go over there, basically, take out a very big stick right in the heart of that world. What Muslims needed to see was American boys and girls going from house to house, from Basra to Baghdad, and saying, 'Which part of this sentence don't you understand? You don't think we care about our open society? You think this bubble of terrorism fantasy, we're just going to let it grow? Well, suck on this,' namely what they did. So in short, a severe dose of humiliation administered by American boys and girls will teach the terrified women and children whose houses they break into, teach them that they better stop terrorizing us. Well, as usual, it elicited a little comment, apart from people who are called misguided sentimentalists. The need not just to control, but also to humiliate the victims is second nature to political leaders as well, as case after case. One interesting case was in 1988. It's the year when the Palestinian National Council formally accepted the international consensus on a two-state settlement. The U.S. by then was becoming an international laughingstock with its unwillingness to hear Yasser Arafat's call for peaceful diplomacy. And the reasons were explained by Secretary of State George Shultz in his memoirs, also a respected statesman. He informed his boss, Ronald Reagan, that Arafat was saying in one place, unk, and he was saying in another place, cl, but nowhere will he yet bring himself to say uncle in the style of abject surrender that's demanded of the lower orders. Well, Israel actually did hear the call for a political settlement, and it reacted at once by declaring that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. Jordan's a Palestinian state by Israeli fiat, whatever misguided Jordanians and Palestinians might think. Washington very quickly endorsed Israel's reaction. It's the James Baker Plan of December 1989. All of this has been quite effectively excised from history. There's no need to sample the reflexive resort to the principle in imperial history. One case that probably has